On this episode of the How to Japanese podcast, I'll be talking with writer and translator Mercedes Clewis. We had a great conversation about breaking into writing and translation, as well as the JET program. It turns out we were both JETs in Fukushima Prefecture, so it's a small world. Mercedes Clewis is a Japanese to English localization editor and proofreader, as well as a pop culture writer and critic with websites like Anime Feminist, But Why Though, and the Anime News Network. She has also previously worked with Siliconera, which is where she got her start with Japanese to English translation. After earning her bachelor's and master's in history, she taught on the JET program in Fukushima Prefecture for 4 years and is currently in the process of returning to Japan. Hello, Mercedes.
Hi.
Thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited.
Yeah, no, it's always great to catch up with other Jets and just anyone learning Japanese, to be honest. And so I'm curious, how did you learn Japanese?
So I I feel like my story is the story of every grad student. I needed a credit. So basically, I went to school at the University of Missouri St. Louis, and part of the stipulation for their museum studies and history program was that you had to either learn a language credit or you had to do a language credit or do your thesis in another language. And
Whoa.
right at the time, my main native language is English. I had previously learned Chinese, but that had all gone because my tutor went to Germany. So I had no one to speak Chinese with. And I figured, well, they're going to pay for it. St. Louis has a sizable Japanese, I think it's like a Sansei and Yonsei community. And so I was like, well, I'm going to learn Japanese if someone's going to pay for it. And that's kind of what got me in. I did an 8-week intensive Japanese program at Washington University where I studied for about 10 hours a day with, I guess, the Japanese version of an ALT if you had a Japanese person coming to the States. Did that. That compressed basically a year into 8 weeks. After that, I took intermediate Japanese 1 and 2, and that's actually where I started to see that I could actually apply the language outside of just America, and that's kind of actually what jumped me into JET.
Oh, wow. That's great. Actually, I had the same start. I took an intensive summer course for my first year of the language, too. It was a lot of study every day. What was your take on looking back on it? What do you think was good about it? What was challenging?
I think what was really good was that, so my teacher, and I just blanked on his name. I think it was Osomatsu, because I think at the time, and this is horrible of me, I think at the time, the only way I could remember it was because that anime Osomatsu-san was out. But he started off our first day speaking in Japanese. And I'll always remember he pointed at his ear and he said, "Kite kudasai." So I didn't know that meant please listen. But you could infer he wants you to listen because he kept pointing at his ear. And that's how he jumped us in, was making it clear that, in this classroom, other than on days when we're explicitly preparing for the next lesson, it's Japanese only. And that was really great for creating as immersive as an environment as I could have without physically being in Japan. I think in terms of negative, 10 hours is a lot to study a day.
Yeah.
I mean, at that time, I was 22, 23. I was already exhausted from being a grad student. And it was a lot of studying. It was a lot of studying. And Midwestern summers are brutally humid, especially in St. Louis. So it was a lot of studying and being sweaty. That's not just fun.
Sure.
It's just not fun. But I think having so much exposure and having Japanese nationals teach, which I will say at the time I thought, oh, this is the best way to learn. Now I think anyone can teach any language, of course. But I think at the time, having Japanese nationals who were teaching us, who I should say also as a stipulation of their participation, they had to learn Korean.
Oh,
So
interesting.
so that they could empathize and they could understand when we got frustrated, they could understand because they were learning Korean and none of them had ever learned Korean. So having that kind of duality of they're teaching and learners at the same time also really helped us, and it helped move through some frustrations because it was hard. I know, everyone talks about languages being hard in general. Japanese was hard at first because I had never spoken it and
Mhm.
I had only heard it, and the technical aspects even now are still sometimes confusing, but I think it was a really good program and I would highly recommend like anyone participate in a program like that.
Yeah, and I mean, before I forget, I want to just give a shout out to St. Louis. My brother actually lives there, so I've spent a good bit of time there the last 8 years. And I mean, not only their museums are great; they're all free,
Yeah,
which are great.
all free.
Our museum's very great collection, but they also have one of I think, the biggest Japan festivals in the country
Yes,
every
on
Labor Day weekend. Yeah.
Labor Day at the Missouri Botanical Garden, which
hmm
is also beautiful.
So yeah, definitely like an underrated Japan community there, and I guess
Yeah.
that's reflected in that. It sounds like it's reflected in that language program.
Yeah, well, that language program, and I also did supplemental weekend studies at like a Japanese school for Japanese Americans, Japanese nationals, because there's a lot of Japanese businesses in St. Louis as well.
hmm
So I was doing Monday to Friday, I was in this 10-hour course, and then Saturday I would force myself out of bed at 6:30 to go all across town for an hour class with gosh, her name was Selene Sensei. She taught, I think she used the book Japanese for Busy People. And we would do these hour-long study sessions, and they were also just as intensive. It was all in Japanese because I was finally at that level where I could understand and I couldn't pretend that I didn't understand.
Yeah.
So I was doing that, and that continued, those Saturday classes continued until I graduated the next year.
Oh, nice. So
Yeah.
even after the intermediate classes?
Yeah, so I took them up in what I finished grad school in 2016, and so my last class with her was 2016 before I left and moved to Japan, which
Wow.
coincidentally was the first time I ever left America.
Okay, yeah. So I guess that answers my other question is, did you go to Japan before Jet?
No, I had never left America at all. I had
Wow.
never been on an international flight. So my first time to Japan was with 3 suitcases and a one-way ticket.
Yeah. I mean, actually, that reminds me, on my flight from New Orleans to, I think we went through Detroit, there
Mm,
was a woman, it was her first time on a plane.
wow.
Yeah. So, I mean, Jet really brings in a lot of different people. That's amazing.
Yeah,
So,
and it
mhm,
it really was because, I mean, that's a long flight. I flew
yeah.
from Houston. It's a 14-hour flight, and it is nonstop.
hmm Yeah, I mean, that's the good news, is that if and you were located at Houston from the time at that time,
Um,
or?
well, so Houston just happens to be where the, embassy for Oklahoma and Texas is.
Okay, got it.
So, you fly with jet, you fly out from usually the city where the embassy is hosted,
hmm
a and so Houston just happened to be it. I'm actually from Dallas, and so
Got it.
Dallas was where I was located at the time after
Okay,
grad school.
very cool. And so when you got to Japan on jet, how did you feel? What was that initial like shock like? How did you feel like your language skills held up?
Oh my god, it was so hard. It was I vividly remember my first month, and I vividly remember that, like, the first time I touched down, Narita was hot, first of all. I
Yeah,
landed on July 24th, 2016. It was burning up.
yeah,
The second thing that hit me was, I can't understand anyone. Everyone speaks so fast.
uh,
And I think that's something every language learner encounters, right? Is you learn it from the textbook, and so you have this very grammatically accurate way of speaking, but you don't have a lived experience of speaking.
hmm
And so what ensued was that I promptly got lost multiple times in the Japanese countryside because not only did I not speak Japanese at the same pace, I had never used public transportation. So my first month really was me stumbling through Japanese and also the police of Fukushima Prefecture helping me out a lot because I
yes,
continually got lost constantly,
yeah.
including my first night in Fukushima, wherein a police officer helped a teary crying 23-year-old me find my apartment.
Oh man, yeah. And this was in where were you located in on the jet program?
I was in Fukushima City, the capital of Fukushima Prefecture.
Yeah, I
So in
was
the northern part.
nice. Yeah, I was kind of pleasantly surprised when you sent me your background about Jet to see that you were in Fukushima because that's where I was too, and
Yeah.
I don't think I realized that when I first got in touch.
Yeah, I don't think I realized that either. And I think that's kind of lovely that we both have that Fukushima connection.
Yeah, and obviously, the Hamanaka Aizu for those who don't know, the prefecture is kind of split into three columns,
Mhm,
basically by mountain ranges, and Hamadori the coast, Nakadori the middle, and then Aizu on the western side,
mhm.
and so they're kind of distinct experiences, but there is a lot of overlap too.
Yeah. Yeah, but I think that's kind of the special thing about Fukushima is they really are very distinct experiences.
Hmm.
Because I lived in, like, Nakadori was a really kind of convenient place to live
Hmm.
because you had the Shinkansen, you have pretty big cities kind of in a line,
Hmm.
but you also have, like, all of the onsen, which is
Yeah.
great. You have the mountains, which I had never seen a mountain, I'd never seen a volcano. It was really cool. It was a really great place to kind of grow into adulthood, which is kind of what I did on Jet.
Okay. And so yeah, learning how to use public transportation, learning how to find your apartment. Yeah, no, totally. I remember, because when I went, it was 2005, so there were no iPhones yet, and
Wow, yeah,
but
that's a different time.
yeah, I had spent time in Tokyo before, so I kind of knew how to acquire a map, and I knew
Right.
which like how to get a map, but then using a map while you're driving out in the countryside was challenging.
Very different.
And so on Jet, let me think. There's a lot of different aspects I want to talk about, but let's go a little bit more with the language
Mm.
experience. When did you start to feel like the language slowed down a little bit, that you felt more comfortable with it?
Honestly, the first time I had to go to the hospital.
Okay.
I think when you can go to a hospital in another language that is not your native or birth language, you've mastered it. You've done it. You've hit a certain level of comfort with it. Maybe I wouldn't say master it in a technical sense, but you can live your daily life pretty okay. So I my first year, as many teachers do, I got very, very sick and
Hmm.
I got strep throat. I had never had strep throat before. But I got it because I taught at 3 schools in my first year. So I was around maybe about 1,200 kids,
Wow.
every week. And someone's lovely child passed me strep throat.
Hmm.
And I had to go to the doctor. And I had like 102-degree fever. I was dizzy,
Oh wow.
but I made it and I got medicine and I got a taxi home and I called one of my coworkers and she brought me okayu and
Nice.
she brought me, all this food, but I did it pretty much on my own. I had some assistance for sure, but that was kind of when I realized, and that was, I guess, about 6 months in,
Hmm.
was when I realized, maybe I'm getting the hang of this. And that's when I started to be able to have 15 and then 30 and 45 and hour-long conversations with my coworkers. When I started to go to places by myself,
Mm.
when I started to really travel a lot more. I traveled some in my first year, but I didn't really go without other ALTs, without other friends because I was nervous. And really after that first year in 2017, like I was able to finally start breaking out. 2016 was kind of that formative 6 months.
Hmm.
2017 was when I really finally realized I can understand and I'm internalizing it and I can build, I have the building blocks to do things now.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, that's interesting because I had a similar experience. I got pneumonia my first year, but for
Oh,
me,
no.
I think I was comfortable using the language. I just wasn't comfortable like rocking the boat and like
Mhm.
calling in sick and figuring out how to get to the hospital in such a small town. And once my supervisor kind of, showed me where the hospital was, where the clinic was, and how to do it, I was basically fine. And but so yeah, I think there's like two levels: being aware, like okay, there's a language piece to this, but also you need, if you're not feeling well, you need to make sure you're contacting somebody.
Right. And I think too, what getting sick actually taught me was that I had also internalized cultural differences, and that's a big part of language for learning, right? Like
Hmm.
learning a language isn't just what you can say, what you can hear, and what you can see or read or engage with. It's also engaging with culture to understand why the language is shaped that way and
Hmm.
why things are said and done and formed and why grammar structure exists.
Hmm.
And as I lay on the hospital bed at the clinic, I think maybe passively in the back of my mind was when I realized I've also internalized the other half, which is understanding what it is to live in the rural countryside of Japan.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the one that really sticks out to me is they made me put on a mask at the clinic, and
Mhm.
I mean, I didn't have anything against it. I didn't even really have a cough, but they were like, this is just etiquette. If you're not feeling well, you wear a mask. Like
Right.
and the doctor even at the time was like, it doesn't really do anything, but I think we know now it probably does do something.
I was gonna say, I think if anything 2020 has taught us is it does a lot.
Yeah. Um, Man, well, that's a great experience. Is there anything language-wise in the hospital that that stands out?
I would love to say there is, but honestly, I was hooked up to an IV.
Hmm.
It's very blurry. I do remember that's when I learned the word for fever.
Okay.
When I learned Netsu. That was when I finally was like, "Oh, they're asking if I have a fever," and then I just kind of, like, went to sleep and let the IV do its thing.
Yeah. I the one that I remember is learning the words for positive and negative. Obviously, certain test results you want to be one way or the other, right? So
Right.
important to know the difference between those two. Insei negative and yosei positive. But
Mhm.
that's great. Well, I'm curious to know. So it sounds like our jet experiences were also pretty different. You were teaching several schools,
Yes.
thousands of students. I was teaching. I had three schools: one junior high, two elementary schools,
Okay.
but they were.
So
Mhm.
even that's different because I was a
Yeah.
high school teacher.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, no, that's like a very different experience. And but yeah, the number of students was, I think, probably. I don't think it was more than, I mean, with elementary school, probably had about 130 total, and then junior high
Wow.
had a couple hundred. So it was a very small town.
Yeah. And I will say, like, the 3 schools was my first year. By my second year, I had 10.
Oh wow.
And then that got reduced down. I taught at, my first year, I taught at a satellite school that closed, when part of the coast reopened. But my second year, I had 10. My 3rd and 4th year, that got reduced down to 8.
Okay. So those are
So,
that's kind of like a one and done situation, or
it one of them was a one and done. They just changed, like, how they were taking on ALTs, and they wanted fresh ALTs, and that was just how they operated. So by my second year, I was kind of not the fresh person anymore.
Mhm.
But then what that led to was, I and I hope this doesn't sound pompous of me. I did my job well, and
Mm.
I know I did a good job because I got recommended. And very quickly, what happened was I was an ALT at a high school as my base school, but I ended up teaching all 3 levels. So I was teaching elementary school,
Oh wow.
junior high school, and high school, and it was because I had gotten recommended.
Okay.
So, I was at agricultural schools, I was at a technical high school, I was at the only, oh gosh, is it ESID, like UNESCO school? I was at the only UNESCO high school in Fukushima.
Okay.
I taught at a school inside of Fukushima's hospital. I kind of did a lot of everything, but what it allowed me is it really changed my perspective on a lot of things. It actually, I think, helped me become a much more accessible person because I worked with students with disabilities.
Hmm.
And I think when you do that, one of two things happens. You either stay the same person or you become very receptive and you open up your world to understand that everybody has a different experience and everybody's body has a different experience. And thankfully, the latter happened to me. But I taught, yeah, at a little bit of everywhere.
Great. Had you taught English before?
I hadn't at all, but I had done some teaching experience. I had some teaching experience as part of my undergrad degree. Um, I think in undergrad, I thought I would have become a teacher, but then I stopped partway, and that's when I really shifted into history. But I had had experience studying and experience with practicum, and because I also did museum studies, I had had experience teaching in museums.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you weren't like totally green. I think I did not have quite that much experience thinking back. But what were some of the things that were useful for you in the classroom in terms of teaching strategies?
I think the most important thing for me was to quickly learn to sympathize with students
Okay.
and to really understand that, like, when high school students act out, they're not acting out to bother you, they're not acting out to cause a problem. There's usually a root frustration. And most of the time, it's that this 15-year-old child does not want to learn English, they don't care about it because from their perspective, their life has only been in this one place in this specific area of the country. They don't see where they can apply the language outside of things. But I think that happens with all subjects, right? Like as a 15-year-old, I certainly didn't see how I was going to apply geometry to other things. Of course, you apply those skills later in life. But I think sympathy and patience were my biggest strategies because, for example, I taught at an all boys school and I'm a woman. And you know, if you are a woman and a foreign woman and you go into an all boys school,
Mm.
the boys are going to act a certain way
Yeah.
because they think they're 15 to 18. They think that they can get away with certain things. They thought that they could say certain words
Mm.
to get a rise out of me. And what would happen was I learned quickly if I just baited them with snacks. If
Hmm.
I was like, "Hey, we're gonna play a game, and if you're good, you can get some candy." Oh, that did it. So I
Nice.
think I think I don't want to say like bribery, but
Yeah.
finding ways to meet the students where they are and where they need you to be versus making them rise to your level as an adult. That was my biggest strategy,
For sure.
and it
Yeah.
always worked.
Having some kind of reward system is definitely smart. I used stickers with elementary school. That was very effective. Going in,
Yeah.
it was funny. I think initially I was very open to teaching at junior high school because the kids were a little bit more mature and they hadn't quite, gotten to that point in high school where they just don't want to be there until about the
Yeah.
third year in junior high and then they're kind of ready. But elementary school was really tough at first. And
Yeah.
after about 6 months, though, I kind of really took to it. One of the teachers kind of at the Christmas party was like, Daniel Sensei, you're doing a great job with the kids who are smart and can do English and are trying, but the kids who are, maybe acting out a little bit and who are struggling a little bit, like you need to do something that's more accessible for them. And that really
Right.
that's kind of what happens in Japan when you're out drinking or socializing, that the truth starts to come out.
Yeah, I tell you, the Boninkai
Hmm.
is where you find out, that's almost more valuable than your assessments you get as a jet.
Yep.
The Boninkai, that's where all of the all of the tea gets spilled,
Hmm.
and that's where you really learn, like, the English teachers will say, like, "Hey, we appreciate you, but, like, can you try this?" And that's a lot of where I picked up on, maybe I should try this different angle. Maybe
Hmm.
if I increase the level of English I'm speaking, if I only answer if they ask me something in Japanese with English, that might help to, kind of separate. And it's that's a lot of it too is one of my biggest strategies was just asking the teachers, what do you need me to do?
Hmm.
Like, what do you need me to bring to the classroom? What kind of materials? What do you want to talk about? What do you want them to learn? How do you want them to engage? And I think it's hard because Japanese teachers are criminally overworked. I
Hmm.
don't know when they sleep,
Hmm.
but I think also opening yourself up and making yourself an accessible person is how Jet becomes the kind of wonderful experience it is.
Yeah, the more you put into it, the more you get out of it.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And for me, that happened in elementary school where it was like uh, pretty after 6 months, I was like, okay, y- you need to try here. You need to, find ways that are going to engage some of these kids.
Hmm.
But the good news is that you kind of have control over it. My teachers, were just open to whatever I wanted to do. And so I was able to kind of put into place these longer term goals, like having all
Right.
the students write their names, even if it was all in capital letters, starting with capital letters and then moving to lowercase and kind of getting them ready for that jump to writing in junior
Yeah.
high. And junior high became a little bit more challenging because it depends on what the JTEs there wanted to do.
Right.
But what was high
Right.
school? How was high school somewhere in
I
between those? Did you have much control or
you
yeah?
it really depends on the schools. So I of course I won't say any of the school names, but
Hmm.
so my base school was just kind of a general high school in the city. There were ranges of flexibility. You had some teachers that like they would start off with an icebreaker. I'm sure in elementary school you did like what is it called, crisscross,
Hmm.
like where you yeah. There was a teacher who was crazy about that and loved it. There were teachers that were more we got to follow the textbook, but like let's add in some spice.
Hmm.
And I that was kind of my experience was like at my all boys technical school. It was much more freeform. Like we would do holiday events. So like Christmas, we would watch Charlie Brown Christmas. Um, Easter, we decorated Easter eggs.
Hmm.
And then like at my school at the hospital, that happened to be typically elementary and junior high school children. So it was more about visitation because
Hmm.
that was essentially what I was doing. It was a school for chronically ill students or students that might be enduring cancer.
Hmm.
And so my experience would be just going and sitting with them and talking to them in English. And, we didn't really use a textbook. What we did more was just engaging.
Hmm.
And a lot of the time I would just be like, oh, hey, I see you have a Nintendo Switch. I like the Switch. Tell me about what you like. So it would really be meeting them at their level and just kind of getting them to even engage with the language even slightly.
That's great. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's so easy when you get into an uncomfortable or new situation, not even uncomfortable, just new, to kind of close off sometimes.
Yeah, it really is, and I think what you said is so true that you get out of debt what you put into it, and I think one of the biggest things I had to get over really quickly was I just had to not care about embarrassing myself.
Hmm.
I the way I looked at it was I was like, these young children have no clue who I am. They didn't I should say they did not know they were getting a black woman
Mm.
until the day they picked me up from the train station.
Mm.
They had no clue what I looked like, right? So I had this beautiful chance to make this first impression. And what I realized was I was like, you know what? I am just going to do the best I can. I'm not going to care if I embarrass myself because that's going to happen.
Hmm.
We're in two different cultures. But what that's going to do is it's going to show the kids that mistakes are natural.
Hmm.
And even when I would make mistakes in English, I from the day one I told them, "Hey, if I make a mistake, you can call me out and you can say, 'Hey, Mercedes, that doesn't look right.'" And what it did was it allowed me to really connect with my students and help them feel more comfortable. And what happened was over the few years I was there, my kids mostly talked to me in English.
Oh,
Now,
great.
obviously, if they met me like at the train station, I was like, well, that's your territory. We'll talk in Japanese.
Hmm.
Unless you want to talk in English, then it's okay. And what would happen was maybe I would meet my kids at Daiso and they'd be with their parents and they would talk to me in English in front of the parents.
Mm.
And so it really created kind of this beautiful cycle of like, if you throw away any hesitancy and you just be yourself and are willing to engage with their kids, it's a really beautiful experience of seeing them actually also want to engage with English. Not always. I think there are kids that just aren't going to like it because they just don't like the subject and it's not a you thing.
Hmm.
They're a teenager. I didn't like math as a teenager and like my poor math teachers probably knew that.
Hmm.
But it's so much less of teaching is less of the teacher and it's just more yeah, kids don't like things sometimes, right?
Hmm. So I also know that you got TEFL certification at some point. When did that
Yes.
happen, and why did you choose to do that, and then how did that affect your teaching?
So I chose to do that in autumn 2017. I got certified in November 2017.
Okay.
And so that was I guess that would have been right at the beginning of my second year contractually in Japan.
Hmm.
I chose to do it because after my first year, I had realized that you know, I didn't know everything about English.
Hmm. Hmm.
In fact, I would say as a native speaker, I really realized I didn't understand technically what
Hmm.
to do with English, like grammatical, and I couldn't there were things I couldn't explain. And when I came to Japan, my goal was to do this job as good as I could. And getting the TEFL just seemed like a natural thing to do because it meant that I would do my job better. And it meant that I could support students better and that I could help them pass like the ACAN, their English test for proficiency better. And so, I had seen information my first year about there being grants for the TEFL. And I don't think I ever actually applied for the grant. I think I just paid out of pocket.
Mm.
But I did it for the sake of the staff and for my students because it was important to me that I be as good of a teacher as I could. And I should say the TEFL was the start of a lot of skill training that I did on my own.
Mm.
There was no pressure from my school or anything. And I know a lot of ALTs go 5 years without a TEFL, but it was important to me that I just always be pushing myself to be as accessible and as knowledgeable for the sake of my students as I could.
That's great. Yeah, no, I think anything you can do. The one thing that always energized me on JET was going to the prefectural conferences where they inevitably had some kind of programming about course development,
Yeah.
classroom teaching
Yeah.
development, things
And
like that was always a great way to kind of
mhm.
freshen up your material, which can get stale pretty quickly.
Yeah. And I know like real talk. I know a lot of ALTs didn't like that.
Mm.
I know a lot of ALTs were like, "Oh, I came all the way from like so to sit here."
Hmm.
But I really kind of liked it. I like sharing ideas. I One of the things I started my first year was I had a massive Google Drive and I would just dump all of my materials that I did for high school in there and give the Google link to anyone who asked.
That's great.
I would just because teaching is not a competition and neither is JET. We are all here to help these kids.
Hmm.
We are all stewards and custodians of the regions we're in, and we're all here to support them. And I absolutely loved the conference because I got to see and hear different ideas. And I even, one year I gave a presentation at it, I think it was my third year, and it was just fun to share and to learn. It was just so much fun. And that's part of what made teaching enjoyable was sharing ideas and getting that fresh inspiration, right?
Hmm. Yeah, no,
Yeah.
that's amazing. The JET has a great support system, so it's one of the better, I think, teaching experiences there.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I mean realistically also, JET pays you very well.
Hmm.
Like they pay ALTs really well.
Hmm.
Um,
So the other thing that changed, I think, between our times is right after I left, they started instituting the change in salary, the kind of raises that you can
yeah.
get. How did that play out in actuality in your experience?
I mean, so I'll say, and I don't mind being candid about what I got. So my first year I was paid 3.1 million yen,
Hmm.
which would be like let's just make it simple. I was paid like $30,000. And out of that, I got 28,000
Hmm.
roughly every paycheck, which, you take out taxes and healthcare, which I didn't mind because national healthcare is wonderful.
Hmm.
You take out healthcare, social security, pension, all of that, and I would come home with about 2,400.
Hmm.
For me, as a former grad student, I might as well have been Scrooge McDuck
Mm.
diving into a pool of coins.
Hmm.
Because I should say, as a grad student, I got a stipend of $811 a month,
Hmm.
which at the time I was like, wow, so much money. As an adult, no, that's nothing. That's nothing.
Hmm.
So for me, it was enough. And I think honestly, it's enough
Okay.
because a lot like for me, I didn't have to have a car.
Hmm.
My travel was reimbursed for everything but my base school because I traveled so much around the region. And then, of course, every year there was an increase. I think it was like I went from 28 to like my take home the next year was actually like 2,700 or, and then they would take out taxes and stuff. So I would get like 25 left.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's one of the highest paid teaching positions you can get in Japan. I think
Yeah.
I guess without having like higher mastery or being on it like a university,
For
which
sure.
even
Yeah.
even that may not be as sweet. And like I have to say, yeah, I was paid pretty well. I will say the fourth year bump is essentially $50,
Oh, okay.
which
Okay.
like that just gets eaten up in your taxes and
Sure.
your health care. But it's
Yeah.
you start off pretty good, and especially if you're somewhere rural. I can't speak for Tokyo because I think if you're in Tokyo, you are
Yeah.
not probably paid enough
Hmm.
considering. But if you're rural like I was, I could like have a book fund and
Yep.
I could go out to eat every time I wanted. I could save up for little trips very easily. Yeah,
Yeah.
you can live really comfortably on jet.
Yeah, and I even, I bought a car. I so before when I was there, they didn't have the raises, so you just made all jets made the same amount. I think it was about 3.3
Wow.
million yen and something
Okay.
like that. And but that was enough for me to get a car. I paid probably I think $2,500 for my car, and
Not bad.
they let me divide it into two payments over 2 months so that it didn't bankrupt me.
Right.
And even with the car, it I was able to put away a good amount of money every year just in
Yeah.
savings. And I don't think and it wasn't until after the first year when I was like, okay, I guess I'm doing okay. I can actually, treat myself to some things here and there
Right.
when I want
And
to.
and I mean like and I'll say like for me cuz I should say I left Jet in July 2020, which
Mm,
I mean the it was stressful.
yeah,
Um and I mean so like the money I had saved really helped when Japan closed down any kind of EMS to America. I had to send everything by boat.
oh wow,
Which was expensive, but
yeah,
because of Jet, I was able to save this money preemptively to afford, my ticket home and all of this stuff. So you really can live. And I was contractually not allowed a car.
okay,
So I just, I rode around in style on my mamachari.
yeah,
Um, but like even that, my bike was $300 even. So I mean, you can really live quite comfortably. Like I said, I can't speak to like if you're a Tokyo or like an Osaka ALT, I imagine that's expensive. If you're in Fukuoka, that's a little pricey because
sure,
of the
yeah,
distance from Tokyo. I would imagine if you're in Okinawa, that also gets a little pricey.
for sure. But the
But
benefits of being in the Inaka, for sure.
I mean, it's great. Give me
Yeah.
all the rice fields I can handle. It's wonderful.
So before I shift to the next topic, I did want to ask if you had any advice for JET applicants. Looking back, I mean, so for me, it's been a good while since I've applied. I've done some interviews through the consulate in Chicago, so I know a little bit about the process. But what was that like for you? What advice would you give
So
potential JET applicants?
I should say, I applied, and I feel bad saying this because I know people don't make it into JET. I applied on a whim.
Mm,
I applied with the mindset like that statistically I would not make it to the interview and I would not get the position if I did. I got it on my first try, which I'm immensely thankful for. But I would say the best thing you can do on your essay, be earnest.
mm-hmm.
Like be earnest. Don't talk to the assumed reader like you're writing your college essay.
Mm-hmm.
Be earnest. Why do you want to go there? Why do you want to be a part of a community? Why do you think that you're the person they should send into that community, into other people's homes, into other people's lives? Be earnest and be earnest in the interview. I think in hindsight, like one of the things I talked about in my essay was I'm a plus size Black woman. And in Japan, you're not going to see a lot of us, but in the countryside, I definitely was the only one.
Mm-hmm.
But I used that as not a weakness, but as a strength. And I talked about that. And I was asked that in my interview. The Japanese consulate member was like, well, okay, you talked about this. Are you worried that, you're going to go into a classroom and the kids are going to stare? And I said, staring is not bad. I talked about staring isn't bad, that engaging isn't bad, that my purpose there and my presence there, can be used as a tool. But I think in hindsight, and I hope it doesn't sound, prideful of me, I think I approached it very openly and honestly and earnestly. And that's really the best thing you can do is to a great degree, be yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Don't put on airs, don't pretend that you're someone you're not, because if they send you over, that facade is going to crack very quickly because your first month on jet is going to be a lot. Doesn't matter if you've been to Japan once,
Hmm.
100 times, a million times. It's gonna be a lot because you are there, and that ticket is one way.
Hmm.
And you're gonna sometimes in your first month, you're gonna say to yourself, "I'm gonna get that first paycheck and leave." I know I did.
Mm.
Said it to myself multiple times. I called my mother multiple times telling her I was going to leave, and I stayed for 4 years. But you be earnest, and I think be earnest if you get the position, if you get shortlisted to go, be earnest when you're in the position and be humble because you are a teacher, but you are also a student. And this is somebody's home that you're going into. You know, you wouldn't go into somebody else's home and like rummage through the fridge and get yourself a snack. This is somebody's home and you have to go into it with the mindset of humbleness.
For
And
sure.
that really will set the tone for your time in Japan,
Totally
especially
agree.
as an ALT. Yeah.
Mm. But yeah, I think everything about that totally strikes a chord with me and seems like the right approach. Because it's very easy to let the setback totally shift
Oh yeah.
your the way your energy and the way your desire to keep going. But you just kind of have to push through, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, like, I'll say, like, my first biggest setback, I had never felt an earthquake. So my
Mm,
first night in Japan on the 29th floor of the Keio Plaza Hotel
mm,
was my first earthquake, and I cried. I was so scared. And that was when I was like, "Oh, I can't do this." And thankfully I had a community saying, "Okay, we're here for you."
yeah.
And I have to tell you, at the end of my first term interview, they were like, "We were really afraid you were gonna leave because you weren't complaining. You weren't
Ah,
saying that anything was bad." And they were like, "We want you to complain if you need to.
yeah.
It's okay." And what I realized was, the community I'm in, they understand that I've never been to Japan, that I've never lived abroad. They're here for me. And I think for most ALTs, thankfully, and I think realistically, not every ALT has that experience, right?
Hmm.
But for most, the teachers and your community, they're there for you. They
Yep.
want to make this as pleasant an experience for you as possible, not because they have some ulterior motive, but because they're just people trying to do good.
Hmm.
And when you let yourself be open to that, the whole world opens up and your experience radically changes for the better.
And Jet 2, I mean, Claire is also fantastic. They have a great support system, and I know that they have interest groups for the incoming Jets. I know they
Yeah.
have, Jets of Asian descent, Jets of
Yeah.
black descent. What
I
was that support group like?
yeah, I mean, so I was a part of Jet. I think it was called Jets AD, so Jets of African descent.
Got it.
And it was incredibly supportive because like as a black woman, hair products are a
Hmm.
thing. Especially when COVID hit, Amazon stopped.
Mm.
It ceased really coming to Japan. So like, figuring out workarounds. I'm also plus sized. That became something that I had to consider. And a lot of people don't realize Japan does have plus size clothing.
Hmm.
And so, having that support, having that community, being able to meet up with people that realistically looked like me. There were 6 of us in Fukushima that I knew,
Hmm.
and we would meet up and go to karaoke and, just have a good black time
Nice.
because having that community is really important to your time there because if you just isolate and spend time with either only ALTs,
Hmm.
with either only ALTs from outside your country or with only Japanese people, you will suffer. You have to integrate all those aspects of your experience together. And that was something like that was definitely a lesson I took from my first year was you have to have your community. You have to engage. You have to find those groups where you can like just vent because sometimes it's frustrating. And venting doesn't mean that you're not grateful or thankful for your experience. Venting is a very human thing to do.
Hmm.
And that's what like Jet's AD and just the groups and like Fukushima's Jet group, that's what it allowed me to do was to just get out some of my stress and concerns and still keep doing the work that I really loved and still love. That's part of why I'm going back to Japan is because I love teaching so much.
Awesome. So you'll be going back for a teaching position?
Yes, I will. This time I'm going to Kagoshima,
Okay.
which I have never visited Kyushu, so I'm really excited because I
It's
love
amazing.
ramen and
It's
I know
amazing.
Kyushu has good ramen.
Yeah.
And I'll be like 2 miles from the ocean, which is really cool. And so I'll be moving to Kagoshima City assumably in about 2 months, fingers crossed.
Yep.
The situation right now is ever changing.
Yeah.
And I'll be returning to teaching. I'll be teaching children and adults.
Great. And I know that you've also been a very active writer, blogger, translator. Where did you get started with that? At what point on your Japanese experience did that come into the picture?
So, would you believe me if I told you it started all last February, right
What?
before COVID hit?
Are you
Yeah,
serious? I'm
I'm
so
not kidding you.
jealous.
I'm not kidding you. So, I had last year on Twitter, and I use Twitter a lot for a lot of my networking. I had kind of put out, that I was like, mm, I don't know what I'm gonna do. And I had kind of put that out in 2019 that I had thought about like translation and localization as something I could do with my Japanese and my experience. But I really hadn't done a lot with it in 2019. I hadn't really pursued anything. And then swing around to 2020, and Jenny Latta, the editor in chief of Silicon Era,
Hmm.
reached out to me on Twitter and was like, "Hey, I'm looking for someone who can do JD translation for journalism for specifically for video game reporting.
Hmm.
And I don't know how things are going to go. We haven't had a meeting yet, but we're going to see if we can include someone like you in our budget. Would you be interested?" And thank God I said yes.
Mm.
I was like, "Yeah, I absolutely would." And I was only with Silicon Era from February to April because COVID hit.
Hmm.
Everybody's everything got messed up. But that was really my first earnest foray into doing anything with translation and localization.
Okay.
And that's kind of been the springboard for everything that I'm doing now.
Wow, the blogging and writing too?
Yeah.
Wow, man, you've been prolific then.
Yeah, I I have to like I try not to think about it a lot, but like I've probably since I started really actively writing because I've always been a blogger. I've blogged all
Okay.
through college. But even now, like I've probably since I really formally made that into work, I've probably written, gosh, close to probably 300, if not 400 articles.
Yeah.
I've written a lot.
That's awesome. And I think I mean, that story hits on one of the key things for me as a freelance writer is you have to be able to say yes sometimes. And
Yeah.
when you see an opportunity, say yes. Tell the editor, yes, I can get it to you. Yes, I can do that story, even if it's not something you're not totally comfortable with, or something that it's going to be something new for you.
Yeah.
Um, Being able to see the opportunities and say yes is critical, I think.
Yeah. There's power in saying no. There's a
Hmm.
lot of power in saying no,
For sure.
but there's a lot of power in saying yes, even if you don't know. And like, that yes was said with a lot of anxiety because I had never translated. I was very unsure of my Japanese skills, even though I had lived in Japan at that point last year for almost 4 years.
Okay.
I was still really anxious about saying yes, but what it resulted in, I wrote, gosh, I think over 100 articles for Silicon Era, and 99% of them were translated.
Wow.
Like, and that was translation I had to do myself. That was reading Game and Watch, that was reading Dengeki Online, that was reading different Japanese sites and having to like piece together with no furigana, with no assistance, having to piece together the gist of it and turn that into a 2 to 400 word article 3 times a day, 5 days a week.
Wow. That's amazing. And having time to
Thank
also
you.
consume some media too, I assume, related to
Right.
these.
Yeah. Yeah. Having to watch, like launch trailers, having to check out different, things that were happening in Japan, maybe like reach out to different sources. So, and I mean, because research is and will always be a huge component of my writing.
Hmm.
Even now, especially now, research is a major component. So that was really my first taste. And I have to tell you, I got addicted.
Hmm.
I love translation and localization. It's why I'm doing what I'm doing. I
Hmm.
love it. And I think it's really important. And I thought back then it was important, but I didn't see a place for me in it.
Okay.
And now I do.
Yeah. How do you develop that voice? How do you develop that presence? Looking back now, what do you think you did well that was really effective?
I think what I did well was that, much like with Jet, I humbled myself and I made myself very open to help.
Hmm.
I would not be here today without the help of the multitude of people who on Twitter, when I said, "Hey, think I want to do translation and localization with Japanese and English," I would not be here if they hadn't have reached out.
Mm.
Um, I mean, the multitude of people I've met. I don't know if you know Maisie. Oh God, what is Maisie's last name? One of the biggest people in video in board game translation that I know is, I think her last name is Maisie Hatchard,
Okay.
on Twitter, and like people like that. And then I think of like Jin, who has helped me, and all of
Mm.
these people who really who popped into my DMs and were like, "Hey, welcome to the community. We got you." And that's really a lot of it, is like the translation and localization community on Twitter helped me get to where I was, and it also helped me remain humble. And I also think just like putting my intentions on Twitter in
Mm.
280 characters or less very openly really helped me. It helped me network.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, participating, that's kind of what I see Twitter as a little bit is,
Hmm.
you can't just get on there and like just listen. Putting
You have
yourself
to be
out there a
active.
little bit. Yeah. That's part of creating that voice, I think. And
Yeah.
it can be fun too. I think it doesn't have to be
Yeah.
like work.
Yeah, because I think realistically, I think we both can admit sometimes it can be work, and sometimes
Mm-hmm.
work can be stressful. When I was first getting started, I had 0 clients. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I had nobody was asking for me. It took me until October last year to really get my first client that was, like, steady work,
Mm-hmm.
and it wasn't realistically, it was not steady, well-paying work, but it was steady work, and it was enough for me to start building up sort of a reputation of being good at doing proofreading, at doing QA, at editing, and that has snowballed to where I am now, and it continues to snowball in the best of ways.
Got it. Just briefly, I'm curious, what were you blogging about back in grad school? What kind of got
Um,
you initially on the internet?
so what got me initially on the internet, I'll be real, was 2012 Tumblr.
Oh, okay, got
I
it.
was
Yeah.
really active into fandom. I've always really been into fan communities. I think it's really fascinating. From a museum historian perspective, it's really fascinating how people build these massive databases of information and catalog the literal history of both the internet and also an interest. And so I was really into I've always been into anime. I was really into anime. I was really into costumes, and that's what got me started. And what my blog eventually, my now unfortunately defunct Tumblr blog, eventually snowballed into was cataloging my time in Japan from 2016. I think I cataloged it from the final picture of me at Houston's airport to like really up until I left.
Hmm.
And I did that on Instagram as well. And I did it because I like writing, but I also like writing about real lived experiences.
Hmm.
And I think there's a lot of great YouTubers covering Japan, but it's always things like anime or pop culture. And when I had this chance to live in the countryside, and I should say that's not that's not everybody, let me clarify, that's not everybody, but a lot of the popular stuff is covering more stuff in Tokyo.
Hmm.
And so when I had this chance to live in the countryside, I was like, I'm just going to write about it. Just going to write about like the really mundane things that happen in the countryside. Like, hey, today I found a really big cabbage on sale. Pretty great. And that was a lot of my content.
Hmm.
And a lot of what I would take pictures of and write about was just like, the train tracks would look really pretty today.
Hmm. Yeah, finding a low stakes way to get some of those initial repetitions, which I know I did on my blog, before I had a domain name,
Hmm.
before I started writing for the Japan Times, was just kind of putting stuff out there
Right.
and being accountable to yourself. And it reminds me of one of my grad school professors. Sometimes people ask me, how much work should I do for free? Um, how much writing do I need to do for free to kind of get
Hmm.
started? And his answer was some. So it was
Yeah.
kind of like, the answer is probably not zero, but I do think that when you're writing for yourself, it's also, I mean, it's unpaid, but it's also, you're not doing it unpaid for someone else, it's for you
Right.
you
It's
know
it's very different when you're writing for free for myself. And that the way I look at how I was blogging was I was writing, it was like a diary that people could read online that I was writing for myself. And if people happened to read, that was pretty cool. But
Hmm.
like it was very low expectations. Whereas now I do have to be very conscious of the fact that like people do read what I write. So,
Hmm.
I I don't write necessarily differently. I would say that I actually write much more like myself now that I'm paid and that people read, because it's just kind of my trademark. But when you're writing for yourself, it is different,
Hmm.
and it's enjoyable in a different way, I think. It can be enjoyable in the same way as writing professionally, though.
Yeah.
But that's a lot of what I was doing, and what that ended up doing was, like I said, it's after Silicon Era. Anime Feminist reached out to me for a podcast, and I believe we were talking about women in Japan,
Hmm.
and it just fell through because the timing of it and COVID, and it wasn't going to be released until November, so it was going to be far less topical, because I think we were talking about that months after the scandal that Japanese universities were
Yeah.
changing women's scores had broken. So, by November that was going to be after, in the pandemic, that was not going to be news anymore. Um, and so what happened from that was that Chiaki, one of the editors at Anime Feminist, reached out, and she was like, "Hey, you interested in editing?" And I was like, "Oh, I love editing. Editing's fun. I did a lot of editing as a grad student." And that is how I became a part of Anime Feminist, was that
Nice.
I like editing. And that also just kind of snowballed into other writing gigs, into me being able to parlay my editing skills into localization, which was kind of the target,
Sure.
was that some way, somehow I was going to get into localization. I didn't know how, but I knew I was going to do it.
Nice. That's amazing. That's what a great experience.
Yeah.
And
It's
so,
it's been fun. It's been a lot of fun.
nice. And before I forget, this is something I probably meant to ask
Mhm.
earlier, but it sounds like you were into fandom before you started studying Japanese. Is that the
Yes.
case? And then, do you remember any of the first works you were able to kind of consume in Japanese?
So I would say, I guess, to answer the first part, I've always been into fandom. I've
Hmm.
always been into fandom. I am still actively a fan fiction writer. I'm a fan fiction reader. I love fan works. Um, I would say the first time I maybe was conscious that I was engaging with fandom was probably in middle school.
Mm.
And I think that's because the internet was at a better place. I mean, it was hard, as a young kid, because I didn't understand the concept of internet. But by middle school, I had enough media literacy to understand and really engage. The first work I remember consuming fully in Japanese, mm, I'm going to say probably it came as an adult, because I mean, growing up, I listened to a lot of things dubbed. Thing that always sticks out to me is the manga Yokohama Kairashi Kiko,
Hmm.
which is this really beautiful post-apocalyptic, like very soft sci-fi manga about like an android who just is living her life in the apocalypse. And it's never really said what kind of apocalypse it is. You just know it's kind of like a climate apocalypse, which feels very fitting. And I started reading this manga while I was in Japan, and I hunted this manga down over 4 years. I have the full collection of the original run, and I'm very proud of it. And that was something that like really helped me engage with Japanese. But I think in terms of animation, the first time I really heard something in Japanese was probably Pokemon.
Okay, cool.
Think like a lot of 90s kids. Um, Anime was really my first touchstone, and then that kind of grew from anime to like seeing Japan less as a pop cultural nexus and more of a fully formed country. And I think on Jet, of course, living with Japanese people and living in country radically changed my views on Japan.
For sure. I mean, you walk into a bookstore, you see exactly how much manga there is, right? That
Right.
it's a medium, it's not
Walls.
a genre.
Yeah, and I mean the diversity of manga. Like it's not just shonen. I'm a big fan of autobiographical manga,
Hmm.
and I really love historical manga. I really love like historical fiction manga. And I mean there's just swaths, there's walls and aisles. And it's, in the States, like you can walk into a Barnes and Noble and they have like, like the two aisles or like the wall shelf. In Japan, you walk in and there's like a whole section. I
Hmm.
mean, there's stores that only sell manga.
Hmm.
So you kind of, your world kind of opens up to, it's less of a genre and manga becomes a medium that people are playing with and doing really fascinating things with.
And I guess that's this is one question that just came to me is how do you
Mm.
find new manga to read? Is that something are you just browsing and then trying here and there, or are you reading recommendations and things like that?
I do a lot of reading recommendations. I get a lot of recommendations off of Twitter. I kind of keep watch, especially with localized and translated manga. I really closely follow like what is Yin Press putting out, what is
Hmm.
Kodansha putting out, and I follow those very closely. I put out for recommendations about once a month. I'll be like, "Hey, I read this manga and I'm really kind of in looking for this kind of taste." And some of it is just like I just take a chance on a lot of manga.
Nice.
Sometimes I'll see a cover and I'm like, that looks interesting. Let me dive in. I'm the kind of fan where I'm open to reading just about anything, just to at least experience it and see why people like it. I really like understanding like why people like something. I might not like it myself, but for me, a big part of my work and a big part of being a pop culture critic is understanding why somebody might have appreciation or why this might appeal to somebody. So
Nice.
I read everything.
That's fantastic. Well, thanks so much. This has been awesome. Just a really interesting conversation. Brought me back to Fukushima, which is always great to talk about, and also just inspiring that you've done so much work so quickly.
Yeah.
It's awesome.
I I really appreciate that because, actually this past month, and I can't say the title yet, but I can hint around it. I wrapped on a very big video game project that I'm very proud of. And it kind of was the first moment in all of this since I've really been doing this in earnest that I realized I was like, I'm a localizer and I'm an editor and I'm really doing it. And it feels nice to hear somebody else say, like, yeah, you've done a lot. You've done a lot. It feels really good.
No, that's cool. Well, I think by the time this comes out, we'll hopefully be able to share that. So that'll be excellent.
Yeah. Yeah, I really hope because it's a burning thing in me. I want to say it so bad, but I
Uh,
can't even say that. I can't say the company.
yeah,
I
no,
can't.
no worries.
So, but I want to.
No, no worries at all.
Yeah.
So I'll end with the three questions that I ask everyone. The first
Mhm.
is, do you have a favorite kind of onigiri?
Oh, okay. Yes. So last year I tried a karaage
Mm,
onigiri, and that was where it's at. I also like
mm.
beef tongue onigiri,
Oh,
especially with like a little shiso. Oh,
okay.
so good.
Man, I have never had either of those, I don't think. I'll have to seek them
Get it.
out. That sounds
Yeah, you
amazing.
got to. Got to.
What's your go-to Japanese karaoke song?
I feel so cheesy. It's Plastic Love by Takeuchi Maria.
Okay, nice. I think actually you're not the first person to mention that. So
Yeah.
I think I am very niche in my Japanese music knowledge. So unfortunately, I have to be embarrassed and say I did not know what that was until a previous guest mentioned it.
That's all right. I forgive you.
Uh,
I only found the song like a few years ago myself.
nice. And I think we talked about this a little bit, but what's something you remember from your first week in Japan when you just think back? What sticks out from that first week?
The first thing I remember was how hot the train was
Hmm.
because I had never ridden on a train, and I was surprised because like the windows, I vividly remember the windows were down to catch kind of that afternoon breeze, and it was warm and the train was creaking, and I remember thinking it's hot, but it's really peaceful.
Hmm.
And like that's when my love affair with trains began.
Well, man, I'll have to have you back on and we can talk trains because I am also a big fan of Japanese
Oh my
trains.
gosh, I love trains. They're so good.
Nice. Well, thanks again for coming on. Where can everyone find you online?
So you can find me on Twitter at Pixelated Lenses. I'm also on Instagram at Pixelated Lenses. And you can look at my professional freelancer blog at backlit.pixels.blog. It's where I reshare all of my writing, and also I post a few times a week just about how things are going.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much and enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Thanks for listening. You can find How to Japanese on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and Substack. And we'll see you next week. それではまた来週。